Okay, we're live. Hi, everyone. So, welcome. We're having some technical difficulties, so we're going to have this is recorded. I'm talking to myself right now. So, welcome, Mark. Thank you for finding time for joining me.
Oh, my pleasure, my pleasure. And it's nice to see you properly and not just be a strange glowing green figure.
I know.
Yes, yes. One of the technical issues was that I was just appearing as a strange glowing green fairy figure because the webcam was doing something strange on the other software. So
You
it's nice
were.
to see you properly. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And it's we just go with the flow. Maybe this was supposed to be recorded. I like to go with the flow right now. So I'll just introduce you a little bit for those of you who don't know you as good as I, because I've studied your work for a long time now. So I'm really excited to have you here. So Mark is an astrologer, teacher, author, psychosynthesis therapist, writer. What else I can add to that? I have the book. I wanna the two. Oh, by the way, I posted like a little excerpt of your book, The Destiny Line. Is it out yet, or?
No, that's the one I'm actually writing. I just put some of the
Okay.
introduction in a newsletter. That one will come out in 1 or 2 years. It takes a while to finish writing it and then to edit it to the sufficient standard. I do have a book coming out in April, but that's a much more technical book in a way. It's like looking at the background architecture of certain archetypes and the way they shape the collective evolution. So I'm looking
Yeah.
at the nodes of planets, the way that the fact that Pluto has nodes or Jupiter has
Exactly.
nodes. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, that sounds interesting. So I'm
Yeah,
looking.
yeah. So I've had a professional researcher help me for the last few years, and we've looked at certain periods of history like the Reformation or the history of depth psychology or the history of science. And we've tried to look at these periods of the history of ideas and then trace these background influences on their development. So it's super interesting on that level. Yeah.
Yes, I absolutely love this part of your work. How it's kind of a combination. What drew to me to your work was the depth, like aligned with the simplicity. Like, and I've noticed that other people, when they talk about a comment, that's the kind of it's really powerful your work in that way, because you kind of translated all this, like you have this background, and that's what I want to go into that maybe as we start, like your the psychosynthesis maybe a little bit, and I love how you explain how you stumbled into Assagioli's work. So I think a lot of people are coming and understanding how incredibly valuable in healing astrology can be. So I wanted to maybe you to talk about a little bit how it led to you until maybe now, and how it started, and the background of psychosynthesis and your like approach as a therapist, because I think it's extremely valuable.
Thank you. Well, and thank you for appreciating the ideal I have in my teaching is that it's technically simple,
Yeah.
but psychologically and spiritually profound.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I'm aiming for. I don't want us to get lost in an intellectual conceptualization of astrology because astrology is such a labyrinthine subject. There's so much you could get lost in.
Exactly.
And really what I'm interested in is psychological and spiritual growth, the transformative potential of human nature. That's what drew me to psychosynthesis. I mean, this is founded by an Italian doctor who was a teenage student of Freud. So he read Freud in the original German, one of maybe only 50 people that bought Freud's first book and
Right.
read it in German,
Yeah.
studied with him in a letter format. And then he was a contemporary of Jung's at the Swiss clinic that Jung
Mm-hmm.
worked in. He was a medical doctor in the First World War working with traumatized soldiers. And by the 1930s, he's expressing this school of psychosynthesis from this vision he's had earlier in life that Freud has only captured a tiny part of the human psyche. He
Yeah.
says that Freud is like someone who analyzes the basement of your house, you know, the
I
cellar.
love that. I listened to
Yeah,
the interview you had with Adam Summer, which was
yes.
amazing. Like, so you mentioned that. Yeah, we keep going. I love that.
And it's like, yeah, and Assagioli said that people live in the first and second floor. You don't live in your basement. You don't live in the cellar.
Yeah.
And so Assagioli wanted a psychology that contemplated both the healthy human, but even more than just the healthy human. He wanted a psychology that spoke of the human spirit, a
Yeah.
spiritual, an explicitly spiritual psychology. I think definitively now the first spiritual psychology. Whatever the flaws of psychosynthesis, and because of Assagioli's interest in theosophy and his closeness to Alice Bailey,
Yeah.
you know, there are people that don't like that, for example. but you cannot deny it was the first explicit spiritual psychology. And I think that's what drew it to me. You know, I was drawn to psychology after some kind of awakening to the greater possibilities of consciousness in my own life. So it was really radically important to me that it was a spiritual psychology. And then because of that, psychosynthesis has two main visions. It says integrate yourself, realize that the central pillar of your consciousness, your I, is free of what it called the subpersonalities. So,
Yeah.
you know, you being a good mother, a good daughter,
Mm-hmm.
you know, all the family roles, or good at work, or a good friend, or a teacher, or whatever. All these roles you play in life, Assagioli said, well, over time, you need to disidentify from those, decondition, and understand the central pillar of your identity, as it were, the kind of individuality in its raw form shining out of you. And then he sought over time, as you uncovered this individuality, he sought to align it to your deeper spirit, to place it within the service, if you like, of the electromagnetic self, which is what I call the radiant spirit behind your identity.
Mm-hmm. I
Yeah.
like that. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And that's akin to Aurobindo's teaching. Sri Aurobindo is this sort of giant figure trying to unite Eastern and Western thought. And he called it the psychic being, that the spirit inside you radiates this love towards the person, towards the individual,
Mm-hmm.
towards you and me, the little person. And this radiatory love he called the psychic being. And I think that's akin to Assagioli's conception of the I and self, and the way that they have this axis of meaning, the central pillar of relationship, which also corresponds to Kabbalistic thought and various other spiritual schools. So Assagioli, you know, is really interested, as well as human psychology, is interested in the initiatory revelation, if you like, of uncovering the soul or uncovering the spirit within you. So his entire psychology is held within this appreciation of what we might call higher forms of consciousness, or superconsciousness, or deeper forms of understanding, which is of course missing from most clinical psychology. There's a lot of very sincere people out there that want to study psychology. They end up going to an academic school
Yeah.
and having to do like logic tests or math.
It happened to me.
Yeah,
That's where it
yeah,
stopped for me, because it was that sensation of I want to explore, but there was the spiritual part was missing, the depth was missing. So it became so technical that I just kind of pulled away, because I did study psychotherapy as well. And then astrology was always in the background. And when sorry to interrupt.
no, it's perfect, isn't it? Well, you're a living example of it, and it's really disappointing, isn't it? I mean, it's be interesting what your experience was, but when you go into psychology with this sincerity, like it's going to speak to my evolution in
Yeah.
some meaningful, energetic terms, and then you encounter simply the logic of clinical approaches, or something that's cut off from the deeper potentials within and would see them as perhaps only pathological.
Yeah.
That's really disheartening, isn't it? I think a lot of people get disillusioned at that point. Yeah.
So that's my intention was always, so I searched it first through psychotherapy of psychology, studying it, and there was something in it and there was something missing, and then there was astrology. And the moment many years ago I decided there was a strong pull to explore astrology, because it took it to a higher level for me at that point. I thought, okay, there's an expansion like added to the psychology, like that dimension or whatever I was learning. And I actually reached out to Kaipacha, I don't know if you know him, Tom Lesher, and
Yes.
he directed me to you. And I did and then it was an instant kind of click, because I listened a few things, and then I read, I think, about your work, and I was like, that's it. And as I started to study your course, the transformational astrology, the base course, it's for years it was all I actually needed. It was, and I like when you talk about it in like Miss Marple approach. I really
Yes.
liked it, because many people get lost, like you say, the technological, and this astrology can be so overwhelming, especially when you want to start and kind of establish something for you. I was overwhelmed for a while, but your work kind of brought it back in, and it was not almost, it was actually like soul soothing, not in a way that only what I want to do out in the world and in my work, but for me personally, the transformation was profound. Like just studying me through your books.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's a crucial part of the vision I have of transformational astrology, is that the astrologers themselves are dedicated to transformation in their own lives and the deepening of their own consciousness. And that's being added to their readings. That increasing depth is what carries the reading, not just an intellectual understanding of the chart. And to clarify for people listening, the Miss Marple principle is, here's this little old lady in Agatha Christie's novels who's this brilliant detective. And she's a brilliant detective because she knows her small village perfectly. She knows every person in it. She knows their psychology, their motivation. And the idea is, if you know 80, 100 people's psychology quite deeply, you can extrapolate the principles of almost all of humanity. If you know a smaller number of people very, very deeply, it brings it back to this deeper understanding of the human psyche or the human soul. And you can use that understanding to help others. And really, that's a microcosm of my work. I ended up being a therapist in private practice, but having all this astrological understanding and teaching astrology, particularly in America, and then coming back to the UK and continuing my practice. And many of the people I work with, I had their charts, even if they didn't know I was using them.
Yeah.
And so I was able to compare, and so I was able to work with, 50, 60, 70, 80 people over a number of years, very, very deeply.
Yeah.
And have their chart.
Mm-hmm.
And then after a while, I could start to see what really worked, what was really effective in people's deeper life change, not just, see, the danger with a one-off astrology reading is that you're caught in the superficial. You're caught in a kind of, that sounded like a nice thing to say, that the attraction of the idea, the aesthetic of the idea itself, that it sounds cool to say. Like some astrologers say that, transit's a movement in the sky. So that's an external event in your life. And then a progression is an internal movement in the chart. And that's something inside you. But I found that doesn't apply. With experience, I found that transits can be internal and progressions can involve an actual thing happening in the person's life. It's like life's not so simple. Life's not so linear. It sounds like an attractive thing to say to make sense of the world, but it's actually, the world is more complex and more non-linear than that. What I found, though, that have been surprisingly effectively true is if you get a really solid read on a small but powerful number of people that you know deeply, your close friends, the first clients you work with, maybe even historical figures that you've studied relatively profoundly, like a real biography of them or something, you can begin to extrapolate, especially if you know their charts well too, how these things begin to work in people's lives. And even with my level of experience now, I'm constantly surprised, and I still have to hesitate. I still offer information in readings in quite a gentle way, because who's to say this person's not. Every now and then there's a complete exception to, I've seen Moon Saturn occur in a whole series of ways, and usually there's some strong parental restriction. The person feels inhibited around authority in some way, Moon Saturn. But every now and then you're surprised. Every now and then it's just this incredibly responsible, really mature person who doesn't seem to have that issue,
Right? That's why I really like the way, and I agree with you completely, because I consider myself quite novice. Even though I love the work and I see how it's growing through every time I work with someone, and even myself, I still learn. It's never ending. But I like that sensation that you put the consciousness and also their life experience first.
Yes.
The information, it's not putting it on it, it's just taking it, and that, as you said, that gentle approach, that respecting the human being first and then offering that information and then tuning into that. That was the first, you were the first one that explained it in a way that it really clicked with me, that I can use astrology this way, because even some readings I got they were disappointing. Even if I was 15 years old, I started to explore and go to, and even I was studying in this school here in Portugal, and I went to this educator, astrologer, and I was quite sad. After I was, it was weird. So when I found your work, it's astrology can be really healing and transformational, but it needs to come. Like you said, also, I think you said in an interview, it's not only the consciousness of the client, it's also the level of consciousness of the astrologer that will provide
exactly. I mean, it's so many points you raise here. I mean, one, the sad reality is many people are disappointed and even occasionally relatively profoundly alienated by an astrology reading,
Yeah,
especially if it's just a series of intellectual statements about an individual without really listening to them. You know, like you go
yeah,
for the reading and then you just receive, you know, statement A, statement B, statement C, statement D about you with no feedback, no interaction.
yeah,
Maybe it's even tape recorded, so you can't even give feedback.
yeah,
Um, Also, there's this unconscious assumption in that you've just been born. You know, I'm 3 weeks away from 49 and I haven't just been born. And if you read my chart and you read it just as the symbols, it's like you're reading me as if I've just been born. I
yeah,
haven't just been born. I've lived nearly 49 years of life, sometimes quite vibrantly. And
yeah,
so it pays on a technical level alone. It's not just respecting people. I think sometimes people who don't fully understand my message, they think I'm just being a kind of nice guy or a counselor type. I'm saying, you know, you should be nice to your clients, like a person-centered niceness. Yeah, I'm
yeah.
not saying that. It's much more than that. It's much more radical. It's
I
that
understand it.
a true reformation happens when you realize the client is actually a living organism who's already lived out huge parts of their chart, and
Mm.
therefore it's technically appropriate to work out how much of the chart the person has already lived. It's more important to do that in some ways than it is to check, you know, the progressions of the previous couple of years or the transits that's been
Yeah,
impacting them. It's certainly just as important. And then when you include the reality of the human being whose chart it is, and of course their reality is much more important than the chart. I would argue your heart, your soul is much more important than your chart. It transcends your chart. Your chart at its best is just a symbolic portrait that might point towards it. When you animate that symbolic portrait, the natal chart, with the living consciousness of the
yeah.
individual you're doing the reading, that's when at its best it can really come alive. That's when people can really light up.
Yes.
And then they feel like they're taking an exciting step of growth in their life, not just some abstract thing. You know?
And that's, yes, and I think that's what studying your work, that like now I'm now in a place where when I do that work and I see that, like that spark and that inspiration, I know I'm doing something right, even if I will be forever learning. And I think you mentioned this in one of your books, I think, where you came to the point where you say you did this reading for, I think, this 60-year-old, or she was 80, and you kind of did the reading and you did all the things, and she said, okay, well, you told me, yeah, I lived that, but she was quite, and then you went further. And that's what I like everyone who kind of takes it a little further, like, 'cause that's kind of, I think we need to bring our own consciousness. I think that's what you do. It's kind of that bringing it further and just going with what you believe.
Yeah, I mean, that was a turning point for me, putting down the style of astrology where you have this list of things you do with the chart. You know, I think that's still better than having no idea. I don't think
Yeah.
it's good enough to have no method. I think it's important for astrologers to have a
Mm-hmm.
method, to rely on something more than just intuition, because who knows, maybe you're having a bad day, or, you know, or your intuition's not quite keyed in.
True.
At the same time, I had this highly developed method, partly trained with Noel Till, his master's in
Mm-hmm.
synthesis and counseling course, and partly from my own work. And I did all of that with this person who was quite self-aware, and they were very congratulatory that you're a very accurate astrologer, young man. I'm very impressed. But it was me that felt the disappointment, because they were just being nice. You know, it hadn't told them anything they didn't already know,
Yeah.
which of course an intelligent, self-aware person, maybe that's not such a big loss. But my vision of astrology is that there's some subtle background, like no matter how well, like this beautiful tree that you've got behind you, that
Mm-hmm.
your consciousness is kind of flowering these multiple branches behind you in all sorts of subtle ways. And in a really intuitive hands, the chart is like a strange kaleidoscope or telescope, or
Yeah.
allows you to just focus in on those many branches behind the person. And when you open to the level of why is the person like this, or what are these, it's why I focused on things like the outer planets sometimes, or the nodes. I
Mm-hmm.
focused on anything that's pointing to an arc of transpersonal development coming into the personal dimension.
Yeah.
So, and the feeling being, if you can intuit where the person's soul is streaming into their personal life, or touching them, or waiting to touch them, maybe they've missed the touch, but it's so close by, that if you can get that feeling and help them open to it, it's so profound. And that lady, when I took that approach and steered more towards an evolutionary vision of astrology, the work I'd learned with Jeffrey Green, my vision of the outer planets is to do with transpersonal memory. She was tears in the corner of her eyes, grateful that we were having a conversation about why her life had been the way it had been.
Yeah. That's what happened. Like when I studied, because I have a Pluto in the first house squaring the nodes.
Yes.
When I studied my own chart, like the revelations I had was like, that was that feeling. It was just like, one thing, it was just like, oh, okay. It was kind of like, I'm okay. One sensation was because I was very struggling with a lot of things. And then it was kind of opened up this, I don't know, it's something open up through the way you explain. So we can maybe go a little bit more into Pluto and the nodes a little bit more, and the skipped steps. The skipped step was because I have it in my experience, like the Pluto is the crunch time, right? It's my crunch lifetime. It's just, do you do it or not? And that's how I felt all my life. But like understanding it on such a deep level, and I needed that deep level. Like superficial didn't, like I couldn't, like, so the depth of it, like, then the subtle kind of, it's like your work has this subtle depth, like it goes like really deep into me understanding like these concepts about me, and then like you say, bringing it out like to my clients, and I'm able. So let's talk a little bit maybe more Pluto and the nodes, and also about the nodes you mentioned. Yeah.
Well, it's super interesting, isn't it? Because the nodes are formed by the moon and the moon's movement. And I increasingly see them as this dynamic togetherness. And that's really what the book, The Destiny Line, which I'm writing at the moment, is about. It's about how the two nodes arise together and they're constantly in this dynamic dance. And in a way, the nodes represent, you know, the natal chart, I liken it to a photograph of the dancer.
Yeah, I like
and
that.
the nodes, the nodes continue the movement of the dance, because the two nodes describe the parabola of motion of the moon.
Yeah.
So they're opening up within the two-dimensional space a three-dimensional understanding of movement through time. And so they're adding an evolutionary arc, a principle of evolving through time of the moon, which I would argue is your most personal level. The moon is the encapsulation of the personal development from birth at Aries, through the development and relationship to your needs at Taurus, the development of language at Gemini, consolidating at Cancer, and the moon as a personal sense of identity. And then Pluto is deeper than the personal sense of identity. Pluto's like the unconscious strata, the unconscious identifications, the deepest security principles within. Moon security is, you know, we always sat at the table at family meal times, and now when I'm away from my family, I still sit at a table formally for dinner. You know, that's a moon type security rhythm. I learned that with my family, and now I do it outside of my family. A Pluto type security pattern is like my fundamental identification to who I am might be challenged by this experience, or might be brought out of me or responded to. You know, in the first house, to do with my instinctual freedom or my sense of myself compared to other things, or in the ninth house for me, you know, this feeling of intense search, last degree Pluto in Virgo in the ninth, for existential meaning, for a religious or metaphysical meaning. So through a teenage crisis, you know, near suicidal crisis intellectually, not personally, but, you know, reading Sartre, feeling the meaninglessness of the world, like a terrible dressed in black teen that I was, coming through to kind of mystical experiences or understanding through poetry and art that these people were pointing to a greater reality, and then tasting that greater reality for myself and realizing everything about the way I'd understood the world was wrong. So these massive revolutions in the fundamental unconscious way I orientate to the world, Pluto in the ninth, my sense of meaning. And once I had that sense of meaning change at 21, 22, ironically, just as I finished university and a master's degree in creative writing, I embarked on a several-year retraining program about my education, because I suddenly realized I'd never learned anything properly because I hadn't grasped the most important point. And that's when I discovered astrology. It was when I was studying Kabbalah in London. I was studying kind of ways that mysticism might help you truly understand yourself. And the guy happened to do a Kabbalistic astrology weekend, Zev Ben Shimon Halevi. And I was like, okay, wow, I've got to look into this.
Yeah.
And somehow that very day I became an astrologer.
Yes,
It's weird. Yeah.
You're right about it. And that's like,
Yeah.
I relate to that level because I live very instinctually, and I know when it feels right, I'll take it. So I'm very familiar, but I saw that you've gone through some of those experiences that it's like, it seems like coincidence, but it's really not. This never is. Like how astrology also came to you, I feel.
Yes. Yes. I think so. I think it suddenly, later on, it feels completely non-accidental.
Yeah.
I mean, even the experience I had first going to Denver for Astro 2000 in 1999, and the lady signing me in, she said, "Are you called Mark Jones?" And I said, "Yes." And she went, "There's another Mark Jones." And at that point, naively, even though I had one of his books, I'd never even made the connection. Mark Edmund Jones, Mark Jones, me. The very man that taught Dane Rudhyar astrology was also called Mark Jones. And she reacted to that, and it made me smile. And I hadn't even thought of it in all those years, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
Yeah,
strange.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
So I'm still learning
Yeah.
as well. So I don't know.
Well, and then I find out recently, okay, so this is
Yeah.
what my researcher and I are uncovering, that the first Mark Jones, who was based in the west coast of America and who taught Dane Rudhyar astrology,
Yeah.
also focused on the nodes before Rudhyar did. And we've just uncovered a quote from a rare book of his where he's saying, perhaps there's a hidden symbolism even behind astrology. And perhaps it's really just to do with the nodes. Perhaps the nodes are the kind of interlocking background web that makes astrology work. And it's almost sometimes it feels like I'm uncovering this thread that the original Mark Jones shared with Rudhyar. And then, of course, Rudhyar was friends with Assagioli.
Yeah.
And they discussed astrology and looked at charts together. And sometimes I feel like I'm picking up this strange thread that got dropped in the middle of the 20th century, partly because of the Second World War, because Assagioli was hounded from his family home. His family home was destroyed. His desk and papers and study were destroyed. He had to live in hiding for several years, with this tremendous personal cost to him, probably cost him his only child, who developed a serious illness during that time of isolation in the mountains during the winter and eventually died from it. So these enormous personal costs that changed the whole evolution of the way these things worked. And we discovered this, you know, a colleague and I managed to get an invite into Roberto Assagioli's archives in Florence.
Yeah.
And as we were in there, someone just pointed to this room and said, you two might be interested in this. There's another side room of a whole other room of papers. And it started with this whole stack that just said spiritual astrology in English on it.
Yeah.
Just boxes and boxes of papers. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's just at that point, I'm just gobsmacked. I'm just one of the few people in the world that might really grasp how important that is and how sad it is that most people learning psychosynthesis in the world and most people learning psychology in the world don't realize that both Jung and Assagioli were profound students of astrology. Profound, not just casual reading a few books, dedicating years of study to it.
Yeah. I definitely have that sensation since like your work is there is something that is really old, but like I don't know really how to explain it, but it feels like what we need as humanity now. It's this depth of work, or bringing something back, or Assagioli's, or whoever's work. There is a combination that you do, like I read your books and I listen to you talk. There's something really important in you. I don't know how to describe it yet, but about the combining the psychotherapy and counseling and astrology and all of that. If that
I feel it's important. I do too. I mean, I feel that it's my life's work or my calling to address that. I feel, so say you and I are having this conversation and we're in the company of Roberto Assagioli and Carl Gustav Jung, you know, who study therapy and taught therapy, but also studied astrology. I think we're in very excellent company at that point, you know.
Yeah.
I think in some ways this is the most interesting place that a certain development in 20th century thought got to. I mean, it probably culminated really in Jung, but Assagioli and Jung, get to this place where the two primary students of Freud who developed a spiritual vision of psychology were both heavily influenced by astrology. In effect, astrology helped them bridge to a spiritual vision of psychology. And I think that is absolutely cutting edge. And I don't think the modern psychological movement recognizes that. And I'm not sure even the modern astrological movement, which is more open-minded, but I don't think they fully grasp it either.
Not yet, I think, yeah. But that's why I want to have you on and have more, maybe in the future, more of these conversations. And that's what I bring through also when I talk about astrology, like how important it is. And I'm still obviously learning, but I think it will be profoundly kind of transformational to all, because a lot more people are being interested in astrology. And I think it's so, like, it can make or break if you find someone who is like disappointing, or find something like I found your work, which was like
Yes.
like a whole new world that actually brought my life to this whole new direction that is absolutely fulfilling when I do, like, how I go through my transformation, then what I bring to my clients and the people I work with, or my family even around. So thank you for that.
Well, I'm super pleased. I mean, obviously I am, but also because it's true. You know, a long time ago I made a decision that effectively psychological and spiritual growth, or really on even simpler terms, the truth is more important to me than astrology.
Yeah.
The nature of whatever you want to call it, the mysterious dimensions of the human psyche, you know, the nature of the soul, if you want to call it that, is more important to me than any conceptual form. It's more important to me than astrology. It's more important to me than psychological theories. And yet these things exist, and they could be incredibly subtle tools in service of that soul, or they could be imprisoning concepts that deny you access to that soul. And that's really the cutting edge of one's development in these fields, it seems to me. Can we learn these concepts? Can we become clinically intelligent, knowledgeable? Can we become good astrologers with a sound method, and yet still keep all of it transparent to that soul impulse, and not cover that soul impulse with our intellectual labeling, our need to control reality or outcomes because of our own anxiety in the face of the complexity of life? You know, these are all the things one has to watch out for all the time, every moment, really. The cosmos asks you from the deepest point in your heart, every moment, do you love? Do you risk adventure? Do you open to the complexity of life and its infinite subtlety and all the different forms it takes? Or do you close and freak out and have to go and have a lie down? And it's, you know, it can be both, can't it? Yeah, it's like that. It's like riding a wave, isn't it? You can't just do it. You don't, yeah. Yeah. You don't just instantly become the Silver Surfer, do you? You have to learn, you know?
Definitely. And we just had another conversation with another person just prior today, that we were talking about riding waves, especially in these moments, like when the consciousness is kind of, we can feel it's raising and changing, and we are kind of being pushed to that, like kind of the edge to learn to do that. We can't be complacent almost anymore. That's how I feel. Like we can't hide anymore so much. We're just being kind of exposed, and we need to learn and heal. And that's where your work and people who actually do this to the soul level can make a profound impact in the world. So I want to talk and want you to talk to a little bit about what's coming up for you. But so one question. So in your work, you still do work with clients, like one-to-one clients.
Yes.
How is it? Do you just go with the feeling, like combining astrology, psychotherapy? Is astrology the main part of your work? How does it look at the moment in your world?
So it's evolved over time. So for a long time, I had a private psychotherapy practice. So I was just a psychotherapist, and I did the astrology. Then I started to blend them. Increasingly, I'm taking the step towards embracing being the astrologer and the teacher of astrology, and putting aside the regular ongoing therapy type work. I retired from in-person work. So I dissolved my practice in a city because I was just so busy working with people around the world that were interested in the astrology. What I do is a kind of intense mentoring that follows up some of the time. So I do chart readings for people. And then when it's useful for people or appropriate, I do mentoring work after the chart reading so that they gain a chance to be supported, to be guided, to continue the alive conversation about the transformational changes we looked at when we were doing the chart reading.
And
so in a sense,
sorry.
Yeah. So in a sense, it's like delineating potential and then still doing a certain amount of work facilitating that potential.
I like to express delineating potential.
Yeah, because can you get a sense of the arc of people's development? And if you can, and they can share that sense with you, they become inspired then about what's possible for them. So it's increasingly stepping away from psychotherapy because it's encouraging more autonomy in the client. You know, they're doing reading work, or they're listening to my courses sometimes, or they're doing self-journaling in between sessions. And it's more like short-term focused coaching, mentoring about their development.
Okay, great. And I will share for everyone who's watching, I'll share the where they can find you. Everything will be in the comments as well. So, and also,
thank you.
Whoever's watching in a replay, because we're not doing this live, you can leave the questions as well. So if something comes to you. So what's coming up? Like, what do you want to talk about? And then I'll post it as well in a written form.
Thank you.
What's coming up for you, where people can meet you, find you, work with you?
So there's a series of levels, really.
Yeah.
The most accessible entry point in terms of price and accessibility are the pre-recorded programs, the Transformational Astrology Foundation course, which is like 24 hours of audio lessons plus accompanying essays.
Yeah, I can see it's incredible for someone who wants to go deep into, but it's like simple and deep at the same time, like I said before, and very easy to learn.
Yeah, that was my attempt to sort of put down my core method. And then there's the Counseling Skills for Astrologers course, which is an attempt to delineate both issues that are raised by being interested in astrology conceptually, how to understand what astrology is offering, but it's also an extended meditation really on self-development, on the difference between your survival self that you may have learned through childhood stress and pressure and your real or authentic self. And it's really designed to trigger in people, even those who are just interested in astrology. It's not really a course for professional astrologers. It's a course for anyone who's interested in astrology to understand what psychology might have to offer for them in simple, direct terms about their growth.
Is it the one that has like the book The Soul Speaks on company?
Yes.
One, yeah?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes. Okay. And then in person, I've started to do a series of masterclasses here in Wales. So there's one in the summer called Turning Points, which is about, revolutionary change in people's lives and studying it astrologically. That one is sold out. But there's one, we're offering the one we did this summer again. This last summer. We're offering it in the autumn. So in the last week of October, we're offering the Leading Edge Masterclass. And the Leading Edge Masterclass focuses on how to work with people at the cutting edge of their evolution, and how to use astrology and any coaching or mentoring that goes around it to bring out that sense of their absolute cutting edge possibility. And it focuses on developmental psychology and how it's used in the chart. It focuses on multiple client examples. It breaks down, for example, chart patterns. So it looks at the way the chart is grouped, planets at the bottom, planets at the top, planets at the sides. Everything from that to more detailed astrological information towards the end on how to track when people come to these crucial developmental moments and how to support them within that. So there's this whole section within it called Principles of Healing, where I share a condensed vision of my work as a therapist. So it's a real add-on for those who haven't had counseling or therapy training to understand how deeply you can explore working with someone, even in a one-off session. You do not have to be a therapist to do this. These are principles that can be brought into single session work, just like an astrology reading. So the masterclasses are like limited to sort of 15 or 18 people, and then they take place in the office home I've got next to my actual home. I've got a former garage converted into a kind of library studio office space. And so we do the classes there. So, so it's really personally embracing. There's this feeling of, You know, we eat lunch in my garden if the weather's there, and I have a lovely garden with an orchard. And,
Yeah.
you know, this real sense of being together as a team, learning, and my research is present, and we have support, and we eat together and live together, and we have a day trip together. So that's this real living sense for people who are really interested or want to dive deeper into my work. There's a workshop in America in the first week of September this year, 4-day workshop on using astrology and psychology to understand healthy relationships, how to use both developmental psychology to understand how relationships are often undermined by unresolved childhood feeling. But I'll also be doing an extended Venus teaching, Venus through the signs, understanding one's core essential needs. So I'm really excited about that. That's in Bend, Oregon, which is supposed to be beautiful in that time of year, beautiful in the autumn.
Sounds amazing.
I know, I'm excited about that.
Yeah, I'll post all for everyone. So I will post
Thanks.
all this
Thanks.
in the comments, and also people can find the plutoschool.com. There's also already the workshops you've done before. So there's quite a lot of resources that people can just explore. And is the course is also part of plutoschool.com and also astrology university, right?
Yes. And because the person that created plutoschool.com with me now runs Astrology University. So Astrology University on a technical level takes care of a lot of the background material, and I teach for them a lot. And when you were mentioning planets square the nodes and the importance of them, I've done this whole series of webinars for Astrology University for the last 2 years on planets squaring the nodes, specific, going through every planet, webinars on just generally all the planets in aspect to the nodes. And these are really accessible. They're like 2-hour solid teachings with multiple examples, and they're really accessible for like, you know, $30 or something. Or, you know, very, very minimal investment to get high quality teaching. And the Astrology University store all of them. They're all retained, the recordings and stuff. So it's an interesting way for those who are interested in planets squaring the nodes, or our conversation about Pluto square the nodes, say. You know?
Absolutely. And I've been, first of all, because of my placement, it was a fascinating subject. And then I'm noticing the people coming in with these placements, and when I go into them, there is so much information. So I'm definitely drawn to that. And also, we didn't touch on Uranus as trauma signature because I haven't previously, prior your work, really found that depth of explanation. But maybe we can talk about it in a different, because
maybe we can do this again and just talk about, because that work is so powerful, that understanding, and it's so worth speaking about it in the right language to understand, especially as I'm also beginning to add a new concept to it. I've been researching the concept of post-traumatic growth, the antithesis of, you know, that trauma can elicit all sorts of responses in a person. It can repeat, but it can also, it can propel evolution, can't it? It can see us expand to encompass it.
For me, like the trauma and the Uranus archetype, and like the way you speak about all the formative years, and I actually listened to this interview with Gabor Mate, I don't know. He talked so well about this the same, like, I don't know, it just clicked for me, the trauma and the formative years, and about addiction and all of these things. Like, I think you, in your work, you explain there is a simultaneous in a depth, and people don't understand how this connects, and how simple kind of understanding and awareness of these things, and of how much impact you're, like, when you are formed as a child, can then bring into your adult life. And then just going deeper, maybe we can do another conversation on this.
Because that's a super important subject too. I mean, when people really care about each other, when there's some genuine love, and yet the relationship goes wrong over a period of years, the most common cause of that, I would observe from all my work as a therapist and as an astrologer and a mentor, is unresolved childhood developmental stress. It's the way that the person was emotionally patterned by the stresses of their upbringing, which they fail to completely understand. Therefore, they can't properly share it with their partner because they don't understand it themselves, or they're in shame about it. So they don't want to share it with the partner because they feel too much shame. And what I've begun to realize over time is that shame is often simply the internalized residue of parental failure. Some shame is nothing to do with the individual. They did absolutely nothing wrong. They just had no conceptual apparatus to understand that the parent was failing them when they were a small child. They're so loyal. Children are so loyal to the parent because they have no other place to go, nowhere else to bond. And in a way, when the parent fails through their own trauma, through their own weakness, through the stresses of their life, the child has no way of understanding that. So they internalize it as, there must be something wrong with me. I have not elicited the response that
and
I
don't
ought to
you
have.
think there is like such big part of humanity, we just live with that to a certain
Yes.
point. We just live with that, internalize, and sometimes die with that without even
Yes.
knowing that's not, like, we didn't create that. We're not like bad in like when we are.
Exactly.
So
Exactly.
that's I think that's like what will be when I go, like when I evolve, and if we can have this conversation, that will be a big part of my work, because I've seen it. It can be so destructive, but then the other side, it can be so liberating once you kind of understand what it means, how you can understand it or transform it, or even in this space of someone holding space for you to understand.
Brilliantly put. That was super exciting. I mean, when you were sharing about how many people in the world secretly live with it, die with it, I mean, it almost made me feel like saying, yeah, I mean, like, let's stand up together. I mean, in a sense, what rises up in my heart is this feeling like, let's get that message out there, because so many people could
Yeah.
have this unnecessary stain on their soul, you know, this unnecessary internal hurt eased within them. It's not like people don't do bad things or that they don't have all sorts of reasons to be guilty or contemplate difficult things, but parental failure being internalized by the naive loyalty of the child as if there's a fault with the child. Wow, if you eradicated that, so much of the world's suffering. If you eradicated that kind of side effect of mammalian evolution, because that's what it is. As a mammal with a long infant gestation, you have to bond, otherwise you'll die, otherwise you won't make it. And yet, as part of that excessive loyalty, you sacrifice your authenticity, you sacrifice this feeling of understanding of you being you, and you learn the same things that crippled your parents.
And then you kind of perpetuate that often.
Yes, yes, yes. And man, let's stand together and break those cycles. Let's be pattern breakers. Yeah.
I think you and me are natural pattern breakers. So
yeah.
in our blood, like some people are here to do things and break patterns. And I think if we have that, like it's our responsibility to do that, you know?
Yes.
So yes. Okay, let's do it.
Brilliant.
I think the universe will create the structure for it. So I think let's put that intention there, and then just do the work and show up when we are supposed to, and have another conversation first, and then see how it goes from there. Yeah.
Perfect. It's been really nice speaking to you. I have to say, your spirit, your intensity of interest, your sincerity and passion for it is just absolutely clear, and it makes it rather joyful to speak to you, to be frank.
Thank you. Same to you. That's why I'm just drawn instinctively. Okay, this is someone I like that spirit of someone that just, it's simultaneously a rebellion, but also a very strong sense of responsibility for humanity and doing what we came here to do. I love that in others. So I'm very excited that you came today, and I'm looking forward to when we can have another conversation, maybe do something more. And like, as you said, something in Portugal, maybe in the future. Like, I'm very
open. That'd be great.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
well,
great.
Thank you everyone who was watching. You can find all the information about Mark in the comments, and reach out if you want to learn more, and have a beautiful day.